Punctuation is the use of spacing, conventional signs, and certain typographical devices as aids to the understanding and the correct reading, both silently and aloud, of handwritten and printed texts. Another description is the practice, action, or system of inserting points or other small marks into texts, in order to aid interpretation, division of text into sentences, clauses, etc. by means of such marks. In written English, punctuation is vital to disambiguate the meaning of sentences. For example, woman without her man is nothing, and woman without her man is nothing have very different meanings, as do eats, shoots and leaves, and eats, shoots, and leaves. The sharp differences in meaning are produced by the simple differences in punctuation within the example pairs, especially the latter. The rules of punctuation vary with language, location, register and time and are constantly evolving. Certain aspects of punctuation are stylistic and thus the author's choice, or typographic language forms, such as those used in online chat and text messages. History. The first writing systems were either logographic or syllabic, for example, Chinese and Mayan script, which do not necessarily require punctuation, especially spacing. This is because the entire morpheme word is typically clustered within a single glyph, so spacing does not help as much to distinguish where one word ends and the other starts. Disambiguation and emphasis can easily be communicated without punctuation by employing a separate written form distinct from the spoken form of the language that uses slightly different phraseology. Even today, formal written modern English differs subtly from spoken English because not all emphasis and disambiguation is possible to convey in print, even with punctuation. Ancient Chinese classical texts were transmitted without punctuation. However, many Warring States period bamboo texts contain the symbols and indicating the end of a chapter and full stop respectively. By the Song dynasty, addition of punctuation to texts by scholars to aid comprehension became common. The earliest alphabetic writing had no capitalization, no spaces, no vowels and few punctuation marks. This worked as long as the subject matter was restricted to a limited range of topics. Punctuation is historically an aid to reading aloud. The oldest known document using punctuation is the measure stele. This employs points between the words and horizontal strokes between the sense section as punctuation. Western antiquity. Most texts were still written in scriptura continua, that is, without any separation between words. However, the Greeks were sporadically using punctuation marks consisting of vertically arranged dots, usually 2 or 3, in around the 5th century B.C. as an aid in the oral delivery of texts. Greek playwrights such as Euripides and Aristophanes used symbols to distinguish the ends of phrases in written drama. This essentially helped the play's cast to know when to pause. After 200 B.C., the Greeks used a system of a single dot placed at varying heights to mark up speeches at rhetorical divisions. Hypostime, a low punctus on the baseline to mark off a comma. Stigmme acutesi, a punctus at mid-height to mark off a clause, and stigm telia, a high punctus to mark off a sentence. In addition, the Greeks used the paragraphos to mark the beginning of sentences, marginal dipples to mark quotations, and a coronus to indicate the end of major sections. The Romans also occasionally used symbols to indicate pauses, but the Greek thesaeus, under the name distinctions, prevailed by the A.D. 4th century as reported by Elias Donatus and Isidore of Seville. Also, texts were sometimes laid out per capitula, that is, every sentence had its own separate line. Dipples were used, but by the late period these often degenerated into comma-shaped marks. Medieval punctuation developed dramatically when large numbers of copies of the Bible started to be produced. These were designed to be read aloud, so the copyists began to introduce a range of marks to aid the reader, including indentation, various punctuation marks, and an early version of initial capitals. Jerome and his colleagues, who made a translation of the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, employed a layout system based on established practices for teaching the speeches of Demosthenes and Cicero. Under his layout per colla e comata, every sense unit was indented and given its own line. This layout was solely used for biblical manuscripts during the 5th–9th centuries but was abandoned in favor of punctuation. In the 7th–8th centuries, Irish and Anglo-Saxon scribes, whose first languages were not derived from Latin, added more visual cues to render texts more intelligible. Irish scribes introduced the practice of word separation. Likewise, Insular scribes adopted the distinction system while adapting it for minuscule script by using not differing height but rather a differing number of marks aligned horizontally to signify pauses. Value 1 mark for a minor pause, 2 for a medium one, and 3 for a major. Most common were the punctus, a comma-shaped mark, and a 7-shaped mark, often used in combination. The same marks could be used in the margin to mark off quotations. In the late 8th century, a different system emerged in Francia under the Carolingian dynasty, originally indicating how the voice should be modulated when chanting the liturgy. The positary migrated into any text meant to be read aloud, and then to all manuscripts. Positary first reached England in the late 10th century, probably during the Benedictine Reform movement, but was not adopted until after the Norman conquest. The original positary were the punctus, punctus elevatus, punctus versus, and punctus interrogativus, but a fifth symbol, the punctus flexus, was added in the 10th century to indicate a pause of a value between the punctus and punctus elevatus. In the late 11th, early 12th century, the punctus versus disappeared and was taken over by the simple punctus. The late Middle Ages saw the addition of the virgula suspensiva, which was often used in conjunction with the punctus for different types of pauses. Direct quotations were marked with marginal dipples, as in antiquity, but from at least the 12th century scribes also began entering dipples within the column of text. Later developments. For the invention of movable type in Europe in the 1450s, the amount of printed material and a readership for it began to increase. The rise of printing in the 14th and 15th centuries meant that a standard system of punctuation was urgently required. The introduction of a standard system of punctuation has also been attributed to the Venetian printers Aldus Manutius and his grandson. They have been credited with popularizing the practice of ending sentences with the colon or full stop, inventing the semicolon, making occasional use of parentheses, and creating the modern comma by lowering the virgule. By 1566, Aldus Manutius the Younger was able to state that the main object of punctuation was the clarification of syntax. By the 19th century, punctuation in the Western world had evolved to classify the marks hierarchically, in terms of weight. Cecil Hartley's poem identifies the relative values. The stop point out with truth. The time of pause a sentence doth require at every clause, at every comma, stop while 1 you count, at semicolon 2 is the amount, a colon doth require the time of 3, the period 4, as learned men agree. The use of punctuation was not standardized until after the invention of printing. According to the 1885 edition of the American Printer, the importance of punctuation was noted in various sayings by children such as, "Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off." With a semicolon and a comma added it reads, "Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off." In a 19th-century manual of typography, Thomas McKellar writes, shortly after the invention of printing, the necessity of stops and pauses in sentences for the guidance of the reader produced the colon and full point. In process of time, the comma was added, which was then merely a perpendicular line, proportioned to the body of the letter. These 3 points were the only ones used until the close of the 15th century, when Aldo Menuccio gave a better shape to the comma, and added the semicolon, the comma denoting the shortest pause, the semicolon next, then the colon, and the full point terminating the sentence. The marks of interrogation and admiration were introduced many years after. The standards and limitations of evolving technologies have exercised further pragmatic influences. For example, minimization of punctuation in typewritten matter became economically desirable in the 1960s and 1970s for the many users of carbon film ribbons, since a period a comma consumed the same length of expensive non-reusable ribbon as did a capital letter. Punctuation of English. There are two major styles of punctuation in English: American a traditional punctuation, and British a logical punctuation. These two styles differ mainly in the way in which they handle quotation marks. The Oxford comma is the use of a comma for the penultimate item in a list. Other languages of Europe use much the same punctuation as English. The similarity is so strong that a few variations may confuse a native English reader. Quotation marks are particularly variable across European languages. For example, in French and Russian, quotes would appear as "Je suis fatigué." In Greek, the question mark is written as the English semicolon, while the functions of the colon and semicolon are performed by a raised point, known as the annotalia. In Georgian, 3 dots were formerly used as a sentence or paragraph divider. It is still sometimes used in calligraphy. Spanish uses an inverted question mark at the beginning of a question and the normal question mark at the end, as well as an inverted exclamation mark at the beginning of an exclamation and the normal exclamation mark at the end. Armenian uses several punctuation marks of its own. The full stop is represented by a colon, and vice versa. The exclamation mark is represented by a diagonal similar to a tilde, while the question mark resembles the @ symbol. Arabic, Urdu, and Persian, written from right to left, use a reverse question mark and a reversed comma. This is a modern innovation. Pre-modern Arabic did not use punctuation. Hebrew, which is also written from right to left, uses the same characters as in English and originally, Sanskrit had no punctuation. In the 17th century, Sanskrit and Marathi, both written using Devanagari, started using the vertical bar to end a line of prose and double vertical bars in verse. Punctuation was not used in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean writing until the adoption of punctuation from the West in the late 19th and early 20th century. In unpunctuated texts, the grammatical structure of sentences in classical writing is inferred from context. Most punctuation marks in modern Chinese, Japanese, and Korean have similar functions to their English counterparts. However, they often look different and have different customary rules. In the Indian subcontinent, is sometimes used in place of colon or after a subheading. Its origin is unclear, but could be a remnant of the British Raj. Another punctuation common in the Indian subcontinent for writing money amounts is the use of or equals after the number. For example, Rs. 20 or 20 rupees per equals implies 20 rupees whole. Further information: Armenian punctuation, Chinese punctuation, Hebrew punctuation, Japanese punctuation and Korean punctuation. Novel punctuation marks, love point and similar marks. In 1966, the French author Hervé Bazin proposed a series of 6 innovative punctuation marks in his book Plumins l'oiseau. These were the irony point or irony mark, the love point, the certitude point, the authority point, the acclamation point, the doubt point, question comma, exclamation comma. An international patent application was filed and published in 1992 under WO number W09219458 for 2 new punctuation marks, the question comma and the exclamation comma. The question comma has a comma instead of the dot at the bottom of a question mark, while the exclamation comma has a comma in place of the point at the bottom of an exclamation mark. These were intended for use as question and exclamation marks within a sentence, a function for which normal question and exclamation marks can also be used, but which may be considered obsolescent. The patent application entered into the national phase only in Canada. It was advertised as lapsing in Australia on the 27th of January 1994 and in Canada on the 6th of November 1995. In computing, various sets of characters are referred to as punctuation in certain computing situations, many of which are also used to punctuate natural languages. Sometimes non-punctuation in the natural language sense are included. General punctuation and supplemental punctuation, a block of Unicode symbols. In regular expressions, the character class is defined to consist of the following characters: